Welcome back to the Michigan Business Beat, brought to you on the Michigan Business Network. Chris Holman here in our studios at the Capital Region International Airport, believe it or not. And we're going to spend a little time with Cliff Hammond. Clifford is a shareholder with Foster Swift, Collins and Smith in their Southfield office. They have, of course, a half a dozen other locations across Michigan. Next, I believe it'll be all of North America. So we'll see how that growth goes. Anyway, Cliff, good to have you on. One of the big issues I know that you are facing, and all the employers that I talk to are facing, let me get into it by asking a few questions here. If an employee approaches their employer and requests to work remotely, is the employer obligated to allow them to do that?
Sure. It's the old lawyer response nobody likes. It depends, right? It all depends on the factors, right? So, I mean, I can tell you generally, I can tell you exactly what you want to hear, which is, no, you don't have to let it happen. However, there are going to be exceptions, and there's going to be times when you have to say, okay, I guess I can. And it's going to depend on a few things. One of them is going to be, what's their job? Obviously, you can't build a fender at home in your kitchen, so that's not going to work, right? So if you work at a factory, that's pretty simple. If you work in an office, it's not that simple. Why? So you have to ask the why reason. Is it a medical reason? All right. Even if it is a medical reason why they ask for it, can they get the job done at home? Do you have the ability to do it? Just because you did it during COVID doesn't mean that you have to allow it to continue now. So you look at the essential functions of the job. What's an essential function? It depends on the job. It depends on what's really happening, not just a job description. So you have to take a look and see whether or not the person can actually get the job done from home if there's a legitimate medical reason to do so and you can't discriminate. So, for instance, don't let all the males go and do their work at home, and then you leave all the females back. And the same thing goes for protected classification. So just be careful when you're doing it.
Just as long as it's consistent, there's some logic, there's a chance. That's pretty much.
That's right. Yeah, it is. And it's job specific, in fact.
So employers, how can they stay compliant when they're hiring remote employees?
Well, generally, it's a pretty simple status, right? You look at your job and you make sure that you're paying people the minimum wage or above. If there are exempt employees, you're doing that. The one thing you have to watch out for is, where are they working? Because if an employee is working in another state, another country, something like that, you may have other additional requirements for leaves of absence, wages, even paying into some sort of work comp because they're out of the state. So you have to make sure you know where those people are working, and to make sure if it's not just Michigan, is it a multi-state or international responsibility? So you have to make sure you know who this person is, where they're working, and what they're doing. You have an obligation to have a safe work environment. So from just a MIOSHA standpoint, you have to make sure it's safe. So you have a right to access their work site to make sure it's done right. And you want to make sure their hours are being kept. You want to make sure you're paying them for all the work they're doing, that they're making sure they're detailing how many hours they work in a week and reporting it. Because what you'll find out is, a lot of times everybody thinks everybody's doing something as long as the work's getting done. But what you find out later is the person says, well, I was working 150 hours a week and you never gave me overtime. And they come back a year and a half later and sue you. So make sure you have all of your policies and practices for a person working out of the office the same as in the office, to make sure you know what they're doing, when they're doing it, and you're keeping an eye on them, and you're disciplining them if they're not acting appropriately.
So are remote workers covered under the Fair Labor Standards Act and the Family and Medical Leave Act?
Yes. I mean, if they're under the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act, when they're in the office, they're going to be under it outside the office as well. And the same goes for FMLA. If you have 50 or more employees within that 75-mile radius, then you're going to be covered. It's no different. And that's important, like we were talking about with overtime, because you have a very difficult time knowing when people are coming and going when they work. It gets a lot more fluid. Everybody's more flexible, which means there's more exposure. So your policies need to be tightened on how you manage their time. So because you can get hit with a FLSA overtime claim or not paying people hours, you'll have a problem.
Wow. So employers, are they able to discipline remote workers? And I'm hoping I know the answer to this.
Yeah, the answer is yes. And that's the good news. The good news is yes. The bad news is if you have to discipline them, that's unfortunate. But yeah, you do have the right to do that. You have the right to discipline. But again, you have to watch out for FMLA. If an employee needs time off, you can't say, well, you haven't been working. And they say, well, I needed time off for FMLA. So be careful.
All right, so listen, a big part of this goes back to the hiring practices, right? So should employers and the HR teams be putting anything special in their handbooks?
You have to make sure you put in a right to revoke and modify the remote work schedule and the policy, be able to take them out, track your time, make sure you're covering all the state laws where the people are working. Make sure you tell them up front in your handbook that they have to advise you if they're working someplace outside the state of Michigan. Make sure they have a safe environment. And overall, just make sure that you're tracking and enforcing your work rules consistently.
All right, so this tells me a little bit that this might be a moving target yet. I remember when we first started talking about some of the other issues, and everybody said, "Oh, with electronic media, etc., we don't know. We're just going day by day." Will this change much?
I'm sure it will. I don't think there's any way around it. It's always going to be a change. And you're seeing that dynamic right now. The going back to the office has been fought by some and accepted by others. And then the rules of how you apply your regulations and your rules to multi-state employees is always going to change. And I think there's just a wild, wild west in some of these areas that we're going to have to find out about.
Well, you help us navigate through it. You understand?
Understood.
All right. Cliff Hammond, shareholder at Foster Swift, Collins and Smith in Southfield, and half a dozen other cities across the state of Michigan. Thanks for being with us. We appreciate it.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
All right, we'll be back. You've been watching the Michigan Business Beat on the Michigan Business Network. I'm Chris Holman.